News Center Maine is partnering with the Maine-Monitor to bring you some of the reporting being done by journalists at the nonprofit independent publication. We are featuring one of their stories each Monday. Today, we're talking about child welfare in Maine. Lawmakers at the State House have been debating changes to how Maine defines child abuse and neglect. Now, Josh Keefe is a government accountability reporter. The Maine-Monitor just published his story about the issue over the weekend. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Amanda. I appreciate it.
Of course. Yeah, very important topic. A lot of people think about this because we've heard so many stories about problems with the state's child welfare system. But how does Maine compare to other states?
So I think what gets lost in the conversation around child welfare in Maine is that if you look at the federal data, Maine actually removes children and investigates children at a much higher rate than other states. For example, between 2018 and 2022, and granted, the data is a couple of years old, that's how federal data works, the national foster care population declined by 15%. In Maine, the foster care population increased by 40%.
Wow.
So while the rest of the country is sort of taking away fewer and fewer kids, Maine has gone the opposite way. And the other real difference between Maine and other states is that about 3/4 of the kids removed from their homes in Maine are removed because of neglect. So not abuse, not physical abuse, not sexual abuse, neglect. The rest of the country, that's about 62%. So what's happening now in Augusta is there are conversations about how Maine defines neglect.
How does Maine define neglect?
So like a lot of states, Maine defines neglect as basically not providing food, clothing, medical care, necessities for children. The difference is that in a lot of other states, there is an exception for poverty. So if you're not providing those things because you can't afford them, it's not neglect. Maine doesn't have an exception for that. And that's sort of what they're talking about in Augusta, is adding that kind of exception. But the other thing that Maine does that's kind of unique is you don't actually have to have abused or neglected your child in Maine to have DHHS involved and potentially remove your child. They can just find that you are likely to. So in most states you actually have to do the thing. But in Maine, they can just decide that you're likely to do the thing.
So you're sitting in on a lot of these conversations in the legislature about changing some of the definitions here.
Yeah.
What are some of the conversations? What would essentially that look like?
Yeah, so there are, I guess, two competing bills in the legislature. One, it was supported by DHHS and a big group of community stakeholders that would add that poverty exception. So if you can't afford to provide necessities, you wouldn't be sort of investigated for neglect. The idea is that we should help those families. We shouldn't just remove their children. That bill passed through committee. There's another bill that went much further that did not make it out of committee. And what that bill did was it basically said that you have to have willfully and deliberately abused or neglected your child. It also added that poverty exception, and it took away that forward-looking aspect of the law, or it would have taken that away. You actually have to abuse or neglect your child. You can't just be found to have likely to abuse or neglect your child. And the argument here is that Maine is taking away what the bill's sponsor, Senator Craig Hickman, said, is that Maine is taking away too many kids. And by taking away too many, or investigating too many kids, and by looking at too many children, you're missing the really bad cases. So as he said, the really bad cases are needles in a haystack. And so to find those, you got to shrink the haystack.
Interesting, because as you were saying too, the state, by stepping in and helping families, I mean, they're already spending money on foster care and they're spending money on lawyers and attorneys and all that. So interesting. Now, have other states tried some of these changes, do you know?
Yeah, so there's an interesting thing about child welfare policy is it's not as partisan as other issues. Like the blue states, red states, there's not, blue states don't do it one way, red states don't do it another way. For example, Texas actually made a lot of changes a few years ago, trying to get families help instead of taking away children, and they decreased their foster care population by about 40%. That seems to be going well. I mean, it's hard to know, but the reports out of there are that child deaths are not going up. Then there's New Jersey, which a few years ago, basically, and this sounds sort of extreme, but more or less stopped finding abuse and neglect. They just started, I mean, the rates went way, way down, and they just started supporting families. Again, it's sort of hard to know exactly because we're not seeing, the cases themselves. All these cases are confidential. It's hard to know, but early reports seem to indicate it's going well. So.
Really interesting stuff. Josh Keefe, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks, Amanda. Appreciate it.
And you can read much more and this full story at the-maine-monitor.org.